And so it happened that a young woman, like many young women and men before her and after her, set out on a quest to find the meaning of life. Many years had passed since she had begun her search, yet she felt no closer to her goal than when she had begun. Then one day she heard that in a distant land there lived a woman who was the high priestess of the lovers of truth, and that she knew all the answers to all of life's deepest questions. And so the young woman made one last desperate journey. Arriving in the distant land after weeks of travel, the woman set out to find the cave on the mountaintop where the high priestess of the lovers of truth was rumored to live. After 3 days of arduous travel, she arrived at the mountain and began to climb, and all day the woman climbed, not even knowing whether the cave would be there. But at day's end, the entrance to a cave came into view. The woman entered the cave, and when her eyes had become adjusted to the dim light of the cave, the figure of a second woman came into focus. Though the woman she saw was aged, her posture was erect like an arrow pointing to something beyond itself. She was dressed in long saffron robes, and her face shone with a translucent hue. But it was her eyes, shining like emeralds against the shadows of the cave, that gave the young woman confidence that her question finally would be answered, that her quest had arrived at its destined destination. And so the young woman, who could no longer restrain herself, in a hesitant whisper said, "I have journeyed far. I have journeyed long. I have journeyed hard to come to you. And I have but one question to ask. Tell me please, what, pray tell, is the meaning of life?" The older woman glanced at her, and their gaze locked in a firm embrace, and in a voice of ineffable sweetness, but with a tone of certainty beyond refutation, the older woman said, "The meaning of life is like a pool of water." The younger woman said, "Come again?" And the older woman repeated, "The meaning of life is like a pool of water." "That's it?" The younger woman said, "The meaning of life is like a pool of water? Is this what I searched so hard and so long to hear? After all I've endured, is that all you have to say? The meaning of life is like a pool of water?" But the older woman remained calm and serene. She seemed to be deep in thought. And finally, she took her shattered companion in her arms and whispered something into her ear with a voice that echoed the sound of angels. And what the older woman said was simply this: "Well, maybe the meaning of life is not a pool of water." Now, last week I offered a number of responses to the question of the meaning of life in Jewish tradition, and in summary, these were: number one, the meaning of life derives from faith in God. Number two, the meaning of life comes from the performance of sacred and significant deeds. And number three, the meaning of life comes from the perpetuation of what outlasts us and of what transcends us. And today, I want to offer a number of additional responses that derive from Jewish tradition, especially from Jewish mystical tradition called in Hebrew Kabbalah. Now, the problem of the meaning of life may mean at least three things. One, what is the meaning of all life? What is the meaning of the universe? Two, what is the meaning of my life? And three, what is the meaning of my life within the context of a specific tradition? And when many of us pose this problem, we mean two. What is the meaning of my life? But our focus of attention here is on three. which is, what does a specific tradition, namely Judaism, have to say about how and why my life or your life has meaning? My task is to present some of the most prominent responses to the meaning of life that developed in the over 4 millennia of Jewish history, tradition, and experience. And your task is to decide whether all or any or none of these responses resonate with you. That is, whether any, all, or some of Judaism's responses to the problem of meaning of life address your individual personal quest and question, which is, what is the meaning of my specific life? I realize that all of these responses may resonate with some of you, and that some of these responses may resonate with some of you, but I'm also aware that all or some of these responses might not resonate with some of you, and that, like the young woman in the story with which I began, you may have to continue the quest on your own. Now, throughout the history of Judaism, the question of the meaning of life has been raised. And in fact, each morning in the traditional Jewish morning liturgy, it is raised anew. In the liturgy, we read as follows, and I quote, "What are we? What is our life? What is our kindliness, our uprightness, our helpfulness, our strength before you, O God? The heroes we extol are as nothing before you. People of fame and renown are as though they never have lived. Those we consider wise are as if without wisdom. Those known for discernment are as if devoid of knowledge. In comparison to you, God, the deeds of mortals are vanity, and all their years on earth are as nothing. Indeed, the preeminence of humans over animals is naught, for everything is so trivial." This is in the daily morning liturgy. And now then comes the prayer book's response to those questions and those problems in the paragraph that I read, where it says, and which we read every morning in our prayers, "But we, your people, the people of your covenant, the descendants of, but we are the people of the covenant, the descendants of the patriarchs." So here we have the view that without relationships, there can be no meaning, and that the key to meaning is relationship, and that the paradigm of the human-divine relationship is the covenantal relationship. And so from this perspective, human meaning derives from committed and enduring relationships, the most significant of which is the relationship with the source of all meaning, namely God. Judaism begins with a covenant between Abraham and the God of Abraham. But in ancient Babylonia, from where Abraham came, both the gods and the world were believed to be subject both to destiny and to chance. In that view, there was no purpose. There was no assumed plan for creation, no assumed intrinsic meaning for human existence. To the contrary, in ancient Babylonia, to the contrary to this, Abraham's God creates a world with a purpose, a world with a plan. Human beings have a purpose and a role in this plan. They have intrinsic meaning. And in this view, the biblical view, human meaning derives from a living covenantal relationship. Human meaning derives from living in covenantal partnership with God. And at the core of the covenantal relationship is love. Love for Judaism is the critical component not only in the divine-human covenant, in the divine-human relationship, but also in all significant relationships. For as the Zohar, the central work of the medieval Jewish mystics, puts it, everything is called love, and everything is established for the sake of love. Jewish sources see this covenantal relationship as unconditional. In this view, true love must not only be love, it must also be true. It must be unconditional. For as the Ethics of the Fathers puts it, if love depends on a transient thing, when that thing ceases, then love ceases. But when love does not depend on a transient thing, says the Ethics of the Fathers, it then never ceases. Hence, in this view, love, or any true relationship, must be real and not counterfeit. It must not be something else pretending to be love. Yet, many people tend to identify counterfeit copies with the original article. For just as networking is not synonymous with developing relationships, so are relationships not always synonymous with love. Nor is love a contractual matter of give and get. It is not a listing on any commodities exchange. In a cost-benefit approach to relationships, we tend to appraise the other in terms of the benefits we hope to derive from association with them, that is, those of our needs that they are expected to fill. But love, to the contrary, creates a value in the beloved and in the loving relationship that goes beyond any appraisal. Love is rooted not in appraisal, but rather in bestowal, not in what we can receive, but rather in what we can give. Love is an inextricable part of the quest for meaning and for value, because through loving we find a person, a relationship, that bestows meaning and that which we value above all else. In love, by bestowing unquantifiable value upon another, we thereby bestow meaning and value upon ourselves. Now, in the best-known Jewish prayer, the Shema, we read the words of Deuteronomy. You all know it. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. And in the order of the liturgy, God's love for us is affirmed even before we affirm our love for God, because the paragraph in the morning liturgy just before the Shema says, with an everlasting love, you, God, have loved us. And only then we recite the Shema, where God is declared to be one. But what does the word one mean there when we say God is one? According to Maimonides, it means one of a kind. It means unique. In other words, the covenantal relationship assumes uniqueness, because love is rooted in the lover's affirmation of the uniqueness of the beloved and in the particularity of the relationship. And precisely because love presumes uniqueness, the partner in love is irreplaceable. Indeed, I would suggest that one way to distinguish between a counterfeit phenomenon often confused with love, such as infatuation, and love itself, would be to apply this test of singularity. Suppose someone with whom you are truly in love is lost to you forever, either through death or departure and permanent separation. You are then offered a double of that departed person, with the same looks, the same voice, the identical gestures. But would this or any replacement be satisfactory? If the answer to that question is yes, then you're infatuated. If the answer to that question is no, then you're probably in love. A person who is truly loved can never be replaced. There are no substitutes, because love is always rooted in the uniqueness of the beloved, in what makes the other person incomparable and irreplaceable. Infatuations are replaceable, because the characteristics we perceive in one person may be found in another person. Infatuations are usually with a person who fulfills a type being sought rather than an individual being loved. Infatuations often objectify the other in terms of something they have, like fame or fortune, rather than in who they really are. Infatuations begin with what each person has, while love begins with who each person is. Ultimately, love is not dependency, but rather interdependency that flows from attending to the expression of our own uniqueness as it relates to the one who we love, and to the uniqueness of the one who we love. Indeed, there is interdependence even in the case of a newborn child, whose very life and sustenance is dependent upon its mother. The child, on the one hand, needs the mother to survive, but the mother needs the child to love and to suckle. For as the Talmud puts it, more than the calf needs to suck, so does the cow need to suckle. In other words, love is a declaration of interdependence. The quest for meaning is a search for what matters most, for what we value above everything else. And of all the virtues, only love can reveal to us those people, those relationships, those values, those ideals that mean the most to us, that most deeply fulfill the soul's search for meaning. For as the philosopher Irving Singer has written, and I quote, "For a person in love, life is never without meaning. For love is not merely a contributor to a meaningful life, but in its own way it may underlie all other forms of meaning." Now, how can we assess a person's spiritual standard of living? A person's financial standard of living is easy to measure. It's simple to audit. I suggest that a person's spiritual standard of living can be determined by identifying what a person values most. And discovering who and what one loves reveals to us what we value most. Identifying our loves reveals the nexus of meaning in our lives. For as philosopher Sam Keen has written, even though we search for happiness through power, money, knowledge, prestige, or work, most of us suspect from the beginning that of all the virtues, it is only love that abides. Now, while many contemporary psychologists continue to consider love as, in the words of one of them named Stanton Peele, a pathological addiction, there are nonetheless psychologists such as Robert Sternberg who have begun to take a more positive view of love. According to Sternberg, there are three primary ingredients in a loving relationship, and these are, number one, intimacy, number two, passion, and number three, commitment. Each of these is not always found in equal measure, but each must be present for true love to occur. Why? Because without passion, love is impotent. But with passion alone, love fizzles into infatuation. Without commitment, love is a passing fancy. But with commitment alone, love can be reduced to a vacuous, impersonal duty. Without intimacy, love becomes a distant relative. But with intimacy alone, love becomes a barren tree. Love that remains a heart condition, namely stuck in the heart, can't get out of there, is destined for dissolution, because love must be translated into deeds for it to flourish. And so, only with intimacy, passion, and commitment together can there be consummate love, and can love flourish and thrive. Now, while modern thought focuses its attention mostly on eros, that is, on erotic love, earlier classical thought dealt not only with eros, but with other types of love, such as philia, which is the love between friends. And in this regard, Aristotle wrote, "Without friends, no one would choose to live, though he had all other goods." Or as the first Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, wrote, "Friendship is deliverance from the anguish of loneliness." In the Talmud, there is a story about Honi the circle drawer, and this story was probably the inspiration for Washington Irving's famous story, Rip Van Winkle. But it is also important in terms of elucidating the Talmudic rabbi's understanding of the nexus between friendship and meaning. According to this story, Choni fell asleep in a secluded cave for 20 years. And when he awoke, thinking he had only taken a short nap, he went out to find his friends and his family. And soon he discovered that all of his friends, and also his wife and his children, everybody who had been close to him, everyone whom he had loved, had died during the 20 years that he had been asleep, and that he was now totally alone. And in despair, Choni prayed to God. In Aramaic, it's o chevruta o mituta, either friendship or death. And God heard his prayer, and Choni died. The moral of the story is that without friendship, without love, life is not worth living. And the corollary is that friendship, intimate relationships, are precisely what makes life worth living, because they serve as a foundation for the meaning of our life. There is a Hasidic story that tells of two Russian peasants getting drunk together in a tavern. And after a few drinks, one of them says to the other, "Igor, do you love me? Are you my friend?" And the other says, "Ivan, of course I love you. Of course I'm your friend." And after a few more drinks, Ivan asks again, "Igor, do you love me? Are you my friend?" And Igor says, "Ivan, of course I love you. Of course I'm your friend." And finally, after they're very drunk, he asks again, "Igor, do you love me? Are you my friend?" And again Igor says, "Yes, Ivan, yes, yes, I love you, I'm your friend." But this time Ivan asks, "If you love me, and if you're my friend, then how come you don't know what it is that hurts me?" Here we see that compassion, empathy, and respect are vital ingredients not only in friendship, but also in love. Or as St. Paul puts in his first letter to the Corinthians, I don't usually quote the New Testament, but I love this quote. He writes, "I may speak in the tongues of humans or of angels. I may know every hidden truth. I may have a faith strong enough to move mountains. But if I have no love, I'm nothing. Therefore, put love first." The intimacy of love and friendship is an intimacy of mutual disclosure. A friend is someone with whom we can share our most secret feelings, deepest fears, greatest joys, most noble achievements, most fervent hopes, most cherished values, and our dreams and fantasies, as well as our most devastating failures and most heart-wrenching sorrows and traumas. In certain Hasidic schools, there was a custom called Dibuk Chaverim, which means the cleaving of friends. And the way in which this intimacy of friendship and love was articulated was by going periodically with one's best friend to a secluded place and revealing to one's friends all of one's hopes, dreams, and aspirations, all of one's innermost thoughts, all of one's failures and disappointments, everything that makes each of us not only who we are, but who we aspire to be. Now, where does love come from? For the Jewish mystics, all love derives from one source, and that source is God. For the Jewish mystics, even the love that we have of God derives from God, because God is the source of all. The great Catholic Spanish mystic, St. John of the Cross, San Juan de la Cruz, had a very similar idea, and he put it this way: we love God with the love that God has given us to love him. We love God with the love that God has given us to love God. And this same idea, almost exactly, is found in the writings of St. John of the Cross's Jewish contemporary, the great 16th century mystic, Rabbi Dr. of Prague, known in Hebrew by his acronym Maharal. And Maharal writes, and I quote, "The love one has for God is not only his own, but derives from God. It comes from God, and we return it to God. Love of God is therefore more fitting than the love of anything else. For in every kind of love that exists between two lovers, though they may cleave to one another, nonetheless, each retains their own individuality. However, in the love of human beings for God, says Judelo, one completely returns one's soul to God to the extent that one loses one's own individuality and completely cleaves to God. As it is written in Deuteronomy, one should love God and cleave to God. This, says Judelo, is complete love." In other words, for the Jewish mystics, the paradigm for complete and perfect love is mystical communion with God. And in their view, human love is but a derivative, but a shadow, an echo, of the mystical love that can be attained between human beings and God. And in this view, the mystical experience therefore serves as the ultimate model for the ultimate love experience. For the Jewish mystics, for the Kabbalists, this ultimate experience can only be experienced in our relationship with the ultimate, namely with the divine, and even then by the very, very few. For as Judelo puts it, only love of God can become complete and perfect love. Why is this so? Because, says Judelo, in human love, no matter how intense the intimacy, each person nonetheless retains his or her individuality. But in mystical communion with God, something else is possible, namely complete union or reunion with the source of everything, namely God. In other words, the goal of the mystical experience in this view is to surrender our individuality, to divest oneself of one's ego to the point where one becomes absorbed into God. And often the mystics give the following analogy to explain it. The soul is compared to a drop of water. God is compared to a great sea. By itself, the drop seems to have its own individuality. But once the drop merges with the sea, it loses its individuality and is absorbed with the sea. Another analogy favored by the Kabbalists compares the soul to a spark of a fire and compares God to a great fire. Without the fire, you can't have the spark. Without the fire, the spark has no life, no vitality. Paradoxically, by reuniting with the fire, the spark both loses its individuality while now continuing to live on as part of the great fire. The mystical experience begins with the awareness that there is a gap between the divine and the human. However, a product of the mystical experience is the awareness that this gap between us and God is only an illusion. And once that illusion has been removed, one becomes aware that each of us is a part of God rather than apart from God. And this process of discovery is, for the Jewish mystic, an exercise in self-understanding and an exercise in self-transformation. It relates to self-understanding because as a result of having attained even only momentary union with God, we realize that we are a part of the divine. And this experience is self-transforming because, to use the paradoxical language of the mystics, and mystics always love paradoxical language, they say, how do you find yourself? You find yourself by losing yourself in God. In other words, we attain self-realization. We attain a higher level of consciousness, a new dimension of awareness, by reuniting with the source of all being, namely with God. So from this perspective, love is transformatory. It recreates us. The intimacy of communion reveals something new to us about ourselves and about the other, and about our relationship with the other, and about what matters most to us. Having communed with the ultimate, with the lasting, our transient concerns, our fleeting needs and desires are cast into a new perspective, and we see ourselves and we see our world in new ways. The Jewish mystics, the Kabbalists, developed a variety of techniques or roadmaps to attaining what they considered to be the most intensive love of God, which they called in Hebrew dveikut, or cleaving to God. Let me mention only a few of their prerequisites for attaining this experience of dveikut, or cleaving to God. Like any love relationship, the first prerequisite for oneness, for intimacy, and for an end to separation, for fusion, is for fusion with the other. The mystical experience begins with the mystic's desire not to be detached or separated from God. And for this reason, the mystics struggled to remove those obstacles that separated him from God. This is why the Jewish mystics emphasized repentance, for example, or as it's called in Hebrew, tshuva, which literally means return. Repentance is a vehicle for overcoming deeds that tend to separate the mystic from his beloved, namely from God. Now, on a more human level, philosopher Sam Keen writes something similar about human love when he says, the most powerful 9-word aphrodisiac is, I was wrong, I am sorry, please forgive me. In other words, sincere repentance is a crucial element both in human love and in the mystical experience. And finally, for the Jewish mystic, cultivation of the moral virtues, especially humility, is a prerequisite for cohesion with God, whereas its opposite, namely the opposite of humility, which is pride or arrogance or egocentricity, is for them an impenetrable barrier that stifles any loving relationship, whether it be between us and God or between us and other people. Because for them, the individual who's full of him or herself is the individual who has no room for a relationship with anybody else. In this view, pride stifles our ability to transcend ourselves in order to be able to forge a relationship with someone else. Pride hinders our ability to care, to commit, and to love. For the Jewish mystics, the cultivation of the moral virtues, especially humility, is not only a crucial prerequisite for achieving the mystical experience of communion with God, but it is also a critical component in articulating the meaning of one's life. And how and why ethics and moral values relate to the quest for meaning of life, for this you'll have to wait until our meeting next week. But until then, let me conclude with 2 observations today. One observation is Kabbalistic, and the other observation is medical. According to the Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics, our love for God is good not only for us, but perhaps surprisingly, they taught it's also good for God, for God's health, so to speak. There is a dominant view in Jewish mysticism that God created us so that God would not have to be alone, so that God would have someone to love, and that God would have someone to be loved by. As I mentioned before, love is a declaration of interdependence. And for the Kabbalists, this interdependence includes even God, especially God. God, in the view of the Jewish mystics, needs our love and needs our deeds to be truly God and to be truly one. And of the many hundreds of examples that could be given in this regard, I just want to cite one example of this idea. In his mystical ethical treatise, The Palm Tree of Deborah, called in Hebrew Tomer Devorah, the great 16th century Kabbalist, Rabbi Moses Cordovero, comments as follows on the Song of Songs, which was understood to be a love poem between God and the people of Israel. And commenting specifically on a verse in chapter 2 of the Song of Songs, which reads, "For I am lovesick," Cordovero writes as follows, and I quote, "It is well known that the Shekhinah, God's presence in the world, is lovesick for union, as it is written in the Song of Songs, for I am lovesick." Namely, in his view, this is God speaking to us. "But," says Cordovero, "Shekhinah, God's cure, rests in human hands, in our hands, to bring Shekhinah the good medicine that God desires." In other words, for Cordovero and for many of the other mystics, human love is required even by God to remedy that which ails God. And the final view, the medical view, with which I'll conclude today, is that love is not only curative for the divine, but love is also curative for us as well. In this regard, physician Larry Dawsey has written, and I quote, "If scientists suddenly discovered a drug that was as powerful as love in creating health, it would be heralded as a medical breakthrough and marketed overnight, especially if it had as few side effects and was as inexpensive as love." In other words, love is intimately related with health, says Dawsey, and this, he continues, is not a sentimental exaggeration, but a scientific view. Finally, in the quest for love, in the quest for meaning, consider what another physician, who's written a lot of books, you may have read some of them, named Deepak Chopra, has written, and I end with his quote. He writes, "Death rates from cancer and heart disease are probably higher among people in psychological distress and lower among people who have a strong sense of purpose, meaning, and well-being. When life becomes meaningless, the body's sustained energy seems to drain silently like a leaky battery. The greatest threat to life and health is having nothing to live for. There is a secret cave of meaning waiting to be discovered in every life, and those who have found it are the teachers I look to for my own future survival. These people," writes Chopra, "are the true scientists of longevity." Thank you.